Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I am here once again with Thomas Farrar. We had an awesome previous episode together talking about his conversion to Catholicism from the Christadelphians to Catholicism. And there was you were Baptist in between or Protestant, non-denominational. And now we're here to talk about Satan in the Bible, I think, especially in the New Testament. And I know that this is connected to your faith journey. So maybe can we talk about, before we get into the actual, paper that I'm looking at here, which is New Testament Satanology and Leading Superhuman Opponents in Second Temple Jewish Literature, a religio-historical analysis. That's a mouthful, but it's a great paper. Um, Thomas, can you talk about, what does this topic mean for you? Why were you interested in writing a really excellent paper on this particular issue?
Thanks, Swan. Great to be with you once again. So as I mentioned in our previous conversation, one of the doctrinal beliefs of Christadelphians, which is the religious movement or group that I was raised in, is that Satan or the devil does not exist as a personal being, but is a symbolic representation of human evil, of the evil that's in the world naturally. So in other words, there's no such thing as supernatural or transcendent evil. And so I suppose I became interested in this subject as I engaged with biblical passages about the devil and about the Satan, and came to see basically that it didn't really square with what I had been taught, that this is merely a symbolic figure. So I would say my interest in this subject is mainly exegetical. It's not that I'm sort of fascinated with evil or something like that.
Right. You're just trying to look at the text of scripture and figure out, and even the historical context of scripture, and figure out, when it talks about, Satan in the New Testament, even the Old Testament, what exactly did the original authors conceive of or think about? Was it just like a kind of, I don't know, a vague force right in the world, or just a name for the evil of the world, or is it actually, let's say, an individual with an intellect and a will that can actually inflict damage and do things in the world and can be attributed as an agent, if that makes sense? So, Thomas, where do you want to begin the argument?
Well, I was thinking I could take you through three basic views.
Mm-hmm.
There are more than three probably, but three basic views I'd want to highlight in terms of approaching the devil in the Bible. And then from there, maybe I can go through the Hebrew Bible and how the idea of the Satan sort of develops from there into something that we find later on in the New Testament.
Yeah, that sounds good. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the three views that I would basically outline here, the first one, what I would call the traditional view or the Orthodox view, is the view of the Catholic Church and, most other traditionally minded, you might say, denominations on the subject, which is that the devil, also known as Satan, is a fallen angel, a transcendent created spirit who, along with some other angels, radically and irrevocably rejected God, and who continues to use his finite power to inflict injuries, both spiritual and even physical, upon man and society. So for a Catholic description of the doctrine, one can see the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Articles 391 to 395. Now, the second view I'd like to highlight is what I would call the Bultmannian view, because one of its main proponents was Rudolf Bultmann, who was one of the great biblical scholars and theologians of the 20th century, one of the most influential, certainly. He was a Lutheran theologian. And there's a very famous quotation that kind of sums up the starting point for his reading of the New Testament, which says, "We cannot use electric lights and radios, and in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means, and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. So he basically regards the world as a closed system. So any occurrences within the world are caused by causes within the world. And even divine action, he would argue, does not take place between occurrences in the world. In other words, God jumps in and does something like a miracle, but rather they take place in the occurrences of the world. So he refuses to allow any notion of transcendent phenomena such as miracles, maybe on the positive side, or demonic activity on the negative side in the causal chain of events in the world. So Bultmann, he observes that the New Testament world is mythical in the sense that it presupposes kind of this three-story universe with heaven, earth, the underworld. It affirms the activity of spirits and demons and the reality of miracles. It teaches blood atonement, and it expects an imminent parousia, that is the second coming of Christ. So he basically says, look, from where we are in the 20th century with our understanding of science, intellectual honesty demands that we cannot accept the worldview that we find in the New Testament. We have to regard all such phenomena in the New Testament, these supernatural phenomena, as unhistorical. Hence, the New Testament myth cannot be taken literally. However, instead of, because he's a Christian, so instead of rejecting the New Testament, he says, no, we have to take it seriously, but not literally. In other words, we have to apply a different hermeneutic than the literal hermeneutic. And the key for Bultmann is that the real intention of myth is not to describe objective reality, but it is to talk about our own authentic reality as human beings. And therefore, what we need to do is engage in what he calls demythologization, which is basically to apply an existentialist interpretation that seeks to make clear the intention of the myth to talk about human existence. So in a nutshell, when the scripture seems to be talking about, say, Satan and demons, it's really communicating something to us about human existence. But so that's the second view. Now, when we go to the third view, in one sense, they may arrive at a similar conclusion to Bultmann, but by different means, because Bultmann acknowledges that the New Testament writers themselves and, the historical Jesus and the apostles seem to have believed in this mythical worldview, which includes Satan and demons. But proponents of the third view may share some of Bultmann's presuppositions about the world being closed to transcendent causes, or at least certain kinds of transcendent causes, but they differ in one key aspect, which is basically they say the New Testament worldview is not really mythical, at least as far as Satan and demons are concerned. So it's almost as though the demythologization has happened already in the minds of the apostles and the New Testament writers, and they're communicating that directly. It's not something that we have to come along later and kind of apply to their writings. So I'll just read off a couple of quotations from modern scholars that sort of hold to this view in some way, shape, or form. So Trevor Ling, I think he was an Anglican theologian, he says, "The devil is a faceless, featureless, disunifying, disintegrating force with sociological nature and function." And he adds that the New Testament writers themselves are remarkably non-committal about this matter of a personal prince of evil. And then a writer named Roberts, who was actually commenting on Bultmann's work, he says, "It seems to me not inconsistent with the synoptic references to the devil to take them as being even originally a picturesque way of speaking about evil in the world." And then quite an influential writer who wrote a trilogy on a sort of evil in the Bible and is Walter Wink. And he contrasts what he calls the popular Christian fantasy that Satan is a literal person with what he calls the Satan of the Bible, which is namely the symbolic repository of the entire complex of evil in the present order, the archetypal representation of the collective weight of human fallenness, a field of negative forces, a profound experience of numinous, uncanny power in the psychic and historic lives of real people. So, and then maybe just one more. In a recent book on demons in the Bible, John H. Walton and J. Harvey Walton basically argue that they're focusing more on demons than Satan, but I think they would apply their argument to Satan as well. They say that the Bible refers to demons not to affirm anything about their nature or existence, but because they are part of the cognitive environment or cultural setting shared by the biblical authors and readers, that is, the ancient readers. And therefore, they are a useful vehicle for conveying meaning. However, they say the Bible does not affirm the content of references to its cognitive environment. And since all of the Bible's statements about demons or similar creatures are such references, the Bible affirms nothing about the existence or nature of Satan or demons. So basically, there are references to these phenomena in the Bible, and the biblical writers may or may not have actually believed in them, but regardless, God is not trying to reveal anything to us, theologically speaking, by mentioning these creatures or these ideas, because they're just sort of part of the background cultural worldview of the time that are being referred to without actually affirming that they are real. Yeah, so I can mention also a Christadelphian author, Peter Watkins, who described the devil as one elaborate, sustained New Testament parable. So the argument here is that as we read the entire New Testament, it's sort of collectively telling us a parable using this figure of the devil or Satan. And it's our job to figure out what is the metaphor, what is the reality behind this figure of the devil or Satan, which Christadelphians would say is basically human sin or the systemic evil in the corrupt, government structures of the world and that kind of thing. So those are the three views. The second and third views are, as I said, similar in the end point that they reach, but quite different in their exegesis, because the second view sort of agrees with the traditional view, the first view, that yes, the New Testament writers are trying to communicate that there is this this mythical reality of transcendent evil, Satan and demons, but we today cannot accept that because of our scientific knowledge and so forth, and therefore we have to reinterpret the mythical language and demythologize it. And the third view says, no, the New Testament writers did not have a mythical worldview when it comes to Satan and demons. They themselves demythologized these ideas and regard them as symbols. So,
right.
Yeah, that I don't know should I proceed to talking about the Bible then?
Yeah, so let me just summarize what you just said there. I know that you gave a summary, but there's the first view, which is the Orthodox traditional view that Satan is a real person or agent in the world. The second view is that the biblical authors might have thought that there was a real Satan, but we have to demythologize ourselves of such a notion, right? And kind of see it as a symbol or something else, but we don't have to accept that it was literal. Whereas the third view is saying, no, the biblical authors themselves didn't even view Satan as a literal figure, but as a symbol and so on and so forth. So, as you said, 2 and 3 both conclude something is mythological here, but how we get there is different. The third view says, no, the Bible itself endorses the mythological view, whereas the second view is saying, no, it doesn't, but we need to kind of not accept that from the text, if that makes sense. So, is that accurate?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that distinction in approach between the second and third views, and hermeneutic, maybe you might say, but
Mm-hmm.
theologically, they're both sort of arriving at the same conclusion.
All right, so talk to me more then about the Bible itself. So we're going into the text itself and trying to settle at this point what the dispute is, or where are you going to take us?
Yeah, and I will just preface it by saying that I'm more of an exegete than a theologian.
Mhm.
I don't have philosophical training, for instance, so maybe towards the end we might get into some of the more theological questions, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert by any means on those. But looking at the scriptures themselves, in the New Testament, there is a figure that one encounters roughly 130 times. So it's something that shows up a lot, called by numerous different designations, of which the most common are Satanas, the Satan, we might say, or it's often translated as Satan without the. It depends whether you regard it as a proper name, a personal name, or a title. And the other one is Diabolos, the devil, is the usual translation of that. And there are a few other recurring terms like Poneros, the evil one, and Archon, the prince. That designation doesn't appear by itself, but is modified by something like the prince of demons, the prince of this world, the prince of the power of the air, are among the modifiers that one finds in the New Testament. Now, one thing we have to notice right off the bat in the New Testament is that most of the references to the devil are what I would call cursory. In other words, they don't mention the devil and then say, oh, you probably don't know what that is, so I'm going to describe who or what the devil is for you. They always seem to assume that the reader already knows what is being referred to by this term. So a good case in point is if we look at the Synoptic Gospels, the first time that Satan or the devil is mentioned in each of them. In Mark chapter 1, verse 13, Mark introduces the figure by saying that Jesus was in the wilderness 40 days, tested by the Satan. Similarly, Matthew 4, verse 1 says, then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested by the devil, or some translations will have tempted by the devil. So there's no mention of, and this is who the devil is, this is what the Satan is. The narrative just carries on as though we are expected to already know who this Satan or devil is. And I think this is particularly noteworthy in Mark, because Mark is generally recognized as being written to a predominantly Gentile audience. The author explains Jewish customs, and the author often interprets Aramaic words because he knows that his readers won't know what they mean. Like Talitha Kumi, when Jesus raises the little girl, for example. But Satanas transliterates a Hebrew or Aramaic word, and yet it's not interpreted. Mark doesn't explain what the word means. So this implies that Mark could assume that his readers were already familiar with the concept. And that's likely because it formed part of the elementary teaching in the early church, sort of the catechesis. And another example of this is in Paul's letters to the Corinthians. So here Paul is writing to a predominantly Gentile church in Greece that he himself founded. And he assumes the reader's familiarity with a concept denoted by the term Satanas. So again, this is a Semitic term from Hebrew and Aramaic, and Paul's writing to Gentiles in Greece, and he's assuming that they know what this concept means. The only way they could know what the concept means is if he himself had previously explained it to them. So basically, the point is the New Testament writers assume that there's a backstory to this figure, but they never actually tell the backstory in so many words. And I think, this, besides the topic of Satan, I think this provides an important insight into the nature of biblical revelation. If we think that the Bible is kind of like a theology textbook, we're at a high chance of misunderstanding it. It doesn't provide us with information according to our own wishes. It doesn't reveal things in a systematic way the way that we might want them to be revealed. Like, oh, there's a mention of the devil. I'm sure God is now going to tell me exactly in a full paragraph who or what this devil is. It doesn't work that way. So before going further with the New Testament, what I'd like to do, and what I did in the article that you referred to, is to see what we can determine about the devil's backstory from the Jewish scriptures and the Second Temple Jewish setting from which the Jesus movement emerged. And in doing so, I'm not going to go through every source that I refer to in the article, because
Sure.
it would just
That'd be
take too
too
long.
much.
I'm just going to, yeah. So I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are particularly important.
And
but
before
just
you,
another,
yeah. I was just going to say, before you do that, I wanted to mention to the audience that the paper is like 50 pages. Well, it's 48 pages exactly, but it is a serious, serious work of scholarship. So I just want to highlight that before you get into all of that.
Okay, so, one of the methodological moves that I made in the article was also to exclude some primary sources, some ancient sources that are often cited precisely to paint sort of the backstory or the Jewish background of the devil. But the problem with these sources is that they are of very uncertain date and provenance. So, for example, there's an ancient work called The Life of Adam and Eve, another one called The Testament of Job, and these are often cited in works on Satan and the devil and the Jewish background thereof. But some scholars believe that these are actually Christian works, and that they may date from, as late as like the 3rd or 4th century AD. So with that doubt, with that significant doubt about their date and whether they're Christian or, non-Christian Jewish, you can't really use them to paint the background to the New Testament. You run the risk of going in circles and being anachronistic. So what I'd like to do is start us off with the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, which are obviously important not just as historical background, but as canonical scripture. And then we'll discuss two canonical texts, which are the Book of Jubilees and the Parables of Enoch. So if we start off in the Hebrew Bible, and just a disclaimer here, I'm mostly book taught, so my pronunciations of Hebrew and Greek words may leave something to be desired. But the Hebrew word Satan occurs in the Hebrew Bible as a common noun, meaning something like adversary or attacker. And quite often it refers to humans. So just as an example, in 1 Kings 11, verse 14, Hadad the Edomite is described as a Satan to King Solomon. But in 4 particular passages in the Hebrew Bible, Satan, the word Satan, is used of a celestial being, of an angel or some kind of heavenly being. So the first of these is in Numbers chapter 22, in the story of Balaam, where the angel of the Lord is said to block Balaam's way as an adversary. The Hebrew says le Satan, which prefixes Satan with this conjunction. And so Satan is a word that is describing the angel's behavior toward Balaam, but is not a designation for the angel. So the angel is not named or titled as Satan. Then in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, the chronicler modifies the narrative of 2 Samuel 24, 1. So both of these chapters have a story about David being incited to take a census, which is then a great sin that must be punished, right? So in 2 Samuel, it's actually God who incites David to take a census. But in 1 Chronicles, the author obviously wasn't too comfortable with the idea that God was the one who incited David to sin, and therefore he introduces this third party, and he attributes the incitement to Satan, which would literally mean an adversary. Now, while most English Bible translations to this day will say Satan stood up against Israel and incited David, most biblical scholars now agree that this translation is anachronistic, as Satan was not yet a proper name. Some scholars believe that this unspecified adversary who incited David was actually a human foe, like a military opponent whose army sort of forced David to count his own troops, something like that. But the majority of scholars, I won't get into the reasons, but the majority believe that it is a heavenly adversary. And this would be kind of analogous to another story in 1 Kings 22, which doesn't use the word Satan, but refers to an unnamed spirit in the heavenly council who volunteers to entice King Ahab to attack the heights of Gilead and go to his death, basically. So those are two of the passages, but I think that the two more important ones in terms of the development of the idea of Satan, or Satanology, if we want to use that term, would be Job and Zechariah. So in the well-known prologue of Job, in Job chapters 1 and 2, and the vision of Zechariah chapter 3, the reader in each case encounters a figure designated Has-Satan, which basically is the word Satan with the definite article in front. So we're now talking about the adversary and not merely an adversary. So scholars agree that the setting of both passages is, as in 1 Kings 22, the divine council. Thus, in these two texts, Has-Satan is almost universally agreed by scholars to be a heavenly being. But since Hebrew proper names almost never take the definite article, and Satan here does take the definite article, Job and Zechariah are not speaking about a being named Satan, but rather a being that's designated as the adversary. And most scholars take this term to actually denote an office in the heavenly council. Has-Satan is an official of the divine council, you might say. And a lot of scholars regard this office as being akin to that of God's prosecutor. While another scholar recently argued, named Ryan E. Stokes, recently argued quite persuasively that the office is actually closer to being God's executioner. But either way, it's sort of like an unsavory portfolio in the heavenly council, in God's cabinet, so to speak.
I mean,
so in Job,
yeah, Thomas, just to jump in here, because there's some interesting things. I know that you're probably going to go into this into more detail, but I mean, I remember when I was a kid and I read about the angel of death. I'm like, wow, he's got an angel for that. You know, thinking about angels as these nice, glowy, happy-looking little flying babies, right? I'm just kidding, but just like angels are typically seen as very positive, happy things, and then you have the angel of death. I guess it shows you that there's a wide portfolio in heaven of what angels are like and what they can be. So, I mean, based on what you're saying here, I'd be interested in kind of, I mean, maybe you'll go into more detail, but to see, okay, how does this square with God having a council? And I don't know if the devil's on it or something else is on it, but just maybe going into that later, we can talk about that. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'll just mention here that I think in terms of history of religion, I think during the Second Temple period, there's kind of a development towards giving a bigger role to angels and kind of heavenly intermediaries to kind of accentuate the transcendence of God. So actions that might have previously been attributed directly to God are now being attributed more to angels and such intermediaries. And I think we see that in the reworking of 2 Samuel 24 in 1 Chronicles 21, where this unnamed adversary is introduced to incite David instead of God doing it. But yeah, the heavenly council is and whether Satan sits on it, and at what point maybe he was kicked out, if that occurred, is an interesting one, which we can come back to. So in Job, the adversarial figure that we are referring to presents himself twice before God among the Bene Elohim, the sons of God, to challenge Job's character and to urge God to test him through suffering. And God agrees, and he actually gives Has-Satan the authority and the permission to attack Job, but he places certain limits on what this adversary can do to Job. Then in Zechariah 3, the prophet sees a vision of the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and Has-Satan standing at his right hand to accuse or perhaps even to execute him. The Lord then rebukes Has-Satan, and the angel of the Lord arranges for Joshua's filthy clothing to be exchanged for white apparel, which seems to denote, kind of like the forgiveness of sins or purification from defilement. So there comes the question of what kind of figure, morally speaking, are we talking about in these passages? Now, most scholars would agree that Has-Satan in Job and Zechariah is subordinate to God's authority. But assessments of his moral character, there's a wide range of scholarly opinion. You have scholars that are calling this figure noble and good on the one hand. At the other extreme, you have scholars calling him insolent or evil. And then in between, you have scholars calling him morally neutral or sort of ambiguous. And I would sort of lean towards the middle category. I think a balanced assessment is that this figure is certainly not yet presented as the malevolent prince of demons or enemy of God at this stage, but there's certainly some tension in his relationship with God, in that he sort of accuses God of sort of taking it easy on Job, and God in turn accuses this figure of having incited me against Job to ruin him for nothing or without cause. So God sort of attributes blame to Has-Satan as well. So to summarize, Has-Satan in the Hebrew Bible is in two passages. There's a German term that I came across in the scholarly literature that I thought summed it up well, called the Funktionsbezeichnung, which means the functional designation. So it's the designation of an office. It's not a name, but it's the designation of an office in the heavenly council, which happens to have sort of an unsavory portfolio or job to accomplish. So just before moving on to the Septuagint, I just want to mention that this biblical background of Has-Satan, the influence of it on the New Testament is evident, particularly in passages such as Luke chapter 22, verse 31 and 32, where the Satan is said to have demanded Jesus' disciples to sift them as wheat. So there is this idea that this figure has to ask permission from God and may even be granted permission by God to do some of his activities. And another one is in Revelation 12, verse 10, where the hymn that is being sung there refers to the devil or the Satan as the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them day and night before our God. So there is this idea still in the New Testament that the Satan still somehow has access to God to make demands of him and to even accuse people, which maybe a lot of Christians might not be aware that that's in the New Testament. So any other questions on the Hebrew Bible, or should we go to the Septuagint?
No, I mean, so this is really fascinating. I mean, there's so many questions that are going through my head right now on, how this all fits with the biblical narrative, what's going on. I know that you probably maybe want to save those more for the end, but if I could ask you maybe one question. So would you say that the figure in Job that accuses, God, or asks for permission to inflict suffering on Job, would you say this is the devil, this is the guy with the horns that we see, or are we not quite there yet? Or is it something totally
Okay,
different?
so I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is more of a both and than an either or.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you why I say that. I think for me, this is a crucial principle of biblical interpretation, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, is that we have to distinguish what I would call the grammatical historical meaning of the text from what I would call the theological meaning of the text.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one would learn in Biblical Exegesis 101 that the aim of biblical exegesis is to discern what the human author of the text intended to express. So the authorial intended meaning is the primary meaning.
Mm-hmm.
However, we can't stop there. So, and I would say at the level of authorial intended meaning, what the author of Job, who wrote the prologue, let's say in something like the 6th century BC, did he have in mind the Satan of the New Testament and later tradition? No. But when the early church were reading Job, did they regard the figure that they encountered there as being the devil that they knew about from, Christian teaching? Absolutely. And so it's a little bit like, in the Hebrew Bible, we have all these passages that the New Testament writers interpret with reference to Christ, messianic psalms, and, even a passage like Isaiah 53, which is, part of the Good Friday liturgy today. Most scholars of the Hebrew Bible would say that at the level of the grammatical historical meaning, that passage is not talking about the Messiah. Okay? There's debates over whether it's talking about Israel collectively or whether it's talking about the prophet himself or something else. But already in the New Testament writers are reading that passage and saying, this is about Christ. So there's sort of this mystical interpretation or theological rereading of the text that goes beyond then what the human author of the text intended to convey. And the one term, Latin term that comes in here is sensus plenior, the fuller sense of the text, that God, because God is ultimately the author of Scripture, God can intend a meaning that was not in the mind of the human author. And I think as Christian exegetes, if we deny this and we say, no, the only valid meaning of the text is the grammatical historical meaning of the text, then we're in big trouble, because we have so many passages that the New Testament writers are not reading that way from the Old Testament. They're taking it from a historical critical point of view. They're taking an Old Testament passage out of context and applying it to Jesus, when clearly the original human author had no notion that he was talking about maybe even the Messiah, never mind Jesus of Nazareth. So I think if we can accept that there is this multi-valency to the Scriptures, that there's the historical critical meaning of Scripture, and then beyond that there's the theological meaning. And even in the Church Fathers, you read about the twofold sense of Scripture, which then becomes the fourfold sense of Scripture. So I think we're very much in line with Christian tradition to view the Scriptures in this way. So that's why I say it's a both and.
Right. So you would say that perhaps the human author who wrote Job wasn't aware, let's say, that this would later become the Satan of the New Testament, right? That we are talking about today. But when later Christian authors and even maybe later Jewish authors looked back, they saw like that figure as the Satan, if that makes sense, as the devil. And so then you were using, sensus plenior to make sense of that. Although I did want to mention too that I know some Orthodox, online. I don't know if all Orthodox believe this or not, but I know some online who have said, no, like Isaiah knew he was talking about the Messiah. Moses knew about the Trinity, like things like that. They would be willing to go, that far. So I know some people that's how they would bridge the gap, so to speak, of the continuity between the old and the new.
Yeah, I don't buy that personally. And I think this, the Catholic idea, articulated by Saint John Henry Cardinal Newman of the development of doctrine, which I know you've talked about before on your channel, really comes into play here, because I think as Catholics we're comfortable with the idea that doctrine develops over time, and and we can find that over the period of biblical revelation itself, and not only after the period of biblical revelation, because we know that revelation is now complete, but the church can still mature on its understanding of the word. So yeah, I don't buy the idea that Moses was self-consciously a Trinitarian, for example.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add something really quick, when you mentioned the fact that we as Catholics are comfortable with development, if you look at like biblical scholarship, right? And I mean, some people might say, who cares what biblical scholars think? And it's like, sure, right? But it's so clear when you really do like a critical study that things developed. Theology, Jewish theology developed throughout the Old Testament, and you see it moving and developing certain trends and keeping other things, and then we get to the New Testament times. So like, there's even development in Old Testament theology. There's development right there in the text itself. If you look at it, if you compare the text, if you examine the literature of the time. And so I just think what you were saying about how Catholics believe the development of doctrine, I think it's actually biblical, right? To accept development, but not innovations, if that makes sense. Because Revelation obviously ended, but and so the church doesn't invent things; it only recognizes that which is in the apostolic deposit of the faith. And so that's just some things that I wanted to lay down.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe I can also just mention quickly one quite interesting take on the devil in the Old Testament. Irenaeus, Saint Irenaeus, quotes a line from Saint Justin Martyr, which is not part of Saint Justin's extant writings, but Saint Irenaeus says Justin wrote that the reason why Satan is kind of like veiled in the Old Testament to a degree, like his true colors don't completely shine forth. It's actually because God wanted to conceal it from Satan himself, because Satan could read the text and God didn't want him to sort of understand what was coming to him. So I mean, that's sort of an interesting take from one of the early church fathers.
Yeah, that's
but
interesting.
I think, the points that you're making here about development of doctrine are also one of the reasons why I think it's important to look at intertestamental or Second Temple Jewish sources outside of the canon itself. It's not that we're saying these are authoritative or canonical, but the Jews were reflecting on the revelation that they had received up to that point, and so you do see ideas developing in the intertestamental period. Even ideas like resurrection, ideas like the Messiah are undergoing a lot of development at this time, and we see the same with the idea of the Satan. So should we go on to the Septuagint?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, which dates for the most part to the 3rd century BC, and which came to serve as the Bible of the early church, basically, at least outside the Holy Land, in the regions of the Roman Empire that were Greek speaking. Now, because translation involves interpretation, whenever you translate something, there's an element of interpretation that comes in. So the Septuagint, even though it's the same text from Job and Zechariah, say, that we just talked about in the Hebrew Bible, there can be a development that occurs just in the process of translating that text. And I think that's exactly what we see in this case. The Septuagint translators' decisions on how to translate this text tell us something about how they understood it. So first of all, in Job's prologue, the term Bene Elohim, the sons of God, is translated into Greek as hoi angeloi tou theou, in other words, the angels of God. So it's explicit that these sons of God are angels. So that reflects that the Septuagint translators' understanding that this is indeed a heavenly scene. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, in both Job 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3, has Satan, it's translated into Greek as ha diabolos. And of course, that term will be familiar as the term that's translated the devil in the New Testament. So this is precisely where that term that we encounter in the New Testament comes from. It's from the Greek Bible, from the Jewish scriptures, the Greek translation of Job and Zechariah. But this is actually a somewhat surprising move linguistically, because there were other options for how to translate the Hebrew noun Satan into Greek. For example, there's a word antikaimenos, adversary, that could have been used, and which Origen, the church father, actually tells us was the rendering of Theodotion's Greek translation of Job, which is another early Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, what makes this ho diabolos a somewhat surprising choice of translation is that the word has a pejorative connotation. It's a more negative term than Satan. So for instance, in Madeleine Wieger's detailed study of the word diabolos in classical Greek, she finds that it denotes someone with the ability and the will to do evil, especially with their words. So it's primarily a verbal, a term that describes the way that someone uses their words. And hence, the New English translation of the Septuagint translates ho diabolos in Job and Zechariah into English as the slanderer. So it's this negative speech coming through. So the Septuagint translators have taken a definite step from regarding this heavenly official as morally ambiguous in the direction of regarding him as morally evil. And that's true even though, ho diabolos is not yet a technical term in the Job and Zechariah Greek translation. So I don't think it would be correct, historically speaking, to translate it as the devil there, because the concept of the devil isn't really there yet. In fact, in another place in the Septuagint, in the book of Esther, the villain of the story, Haman, is actually called Haman ho diabolos, Haman the slanderer, in Esther 8, verse 1. So it's definitely not like a technical term that's reserved for this figure of Satan as of yet. So in this way, from looking at the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint, we find that both of the New Testament's main designations for the devil are accounted for. Ho Satanas is simply a transliteration of the Hebrew Bible's term Satan with the definite article in front, although scholars have argued that it's actually a transliteration of the Aramaic equivalent Satana. But one way or the other, it's coming indirectly from the Hebrew Bible into the New Testament. And then the term ho diabolos, the devil in the New Testament, as we said, comes from the Septuagint of Job and Zechariah. Now, there are two possible references to this figure or figures in the deuterocanonical books in Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon, but it would require quite a technical discussion to get into those two texts. So I'm going to skip over them because they don't really add much to our understanding, but they are discussed in the article. So I want to then go to the Book of Jubilees. So we're now going outside the canon. And this is a book that is of great importance for understanding the development of ideas around Satan. This book was composed in the mid-2nd century BC, and it's basically a retelling of Genesis and half of Exodus. The work survives in its entirety only in Ge'ez, which is the ancient Ethiopic language, and it also has fragments in Hebrew surviving from the Dead Sea Scrolls and portions in Latin and Greek later translations, but it was originally written in Hebrew. So there is a figure in the Ge'ez version that survives. There is a figure designated as Mastema or Prince Mastema. So for instance, in Jubilees chapter 10, God is about to imprison all the evil spirits, but Mastema then appeals to God that 1/10 of the spirits be left to him so that he might, quote, exercise the authority of my will among the children of men. And God then grants his request. So he says, okay, I'll leave 1/10 of the evil spirits to be under your control. And thereafter, Mastema is introduced at strategic points in the narrative. So remember, this is a retelling of stories that are in Genesis and Exodus, but now Mastema becomes a character in the story. So for example, he sends birds to devour the seed sown in the land to bring about a famine, but he's thwarted by a young Abram. And that story might call to mind some connections with the parable of the sower in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus interprets the birds who devour the seed to be the Satan. It's also Mastema who provokes God to test Abraham by ordering him to sacrifice Isaac. So it's kind of like a rereading of that story about Isaac through the lens of Job, because now Satan is urging God to test Abraham, much like Satan urges God to test Job in the book of Job. It's also mastema. There's this peculiar text in Exodus chapter 4 where Moses is on his way to Egypt, and it says the Lord tried to kill him, which is quite a puzzling text. And Jubilees deals with that by saying, no, it was actually mastema who tried to kill Moses. It's also mastema who enables Pharaoh's magicians to perform wonders, like turning the rods into snakes and so on. And it's also mastema who is the destroyer who kills the Egyptian firstborn at the end of the 10 plagues. So mastema's role in these accounts is very similar to that of Has-Satan in Job and Zechariah. Now you might wonder, where does this name mastema come from? What does it mean? So mastema is actually a transliteration of a Hebrew word meaning loathing or hostility. And it's quite a rare word. And so it's possible that when Jubilees was being translated into other languages and eventually into Ge'ez, mastema was mistaken for a proper name. But it may be that in the original Hebrew text, the being was denoted as Malak HaMastema, the angel of hostility, or Sar HaMastema, the prince of hostility. And one reason why that's suspected is because there is a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls called 4Q Jubilees, pseudo Jubilees, sorry. So it's kind of like a pseudo version of Jubilees, if you like, very similar to Jubilees in its outlook. And it describes a figure called the I can't remember if it's the Prince of Hostility or the Angel of Hostility, but it's likely that this was the original term for this adversary in the Book of Jubilees. So what is very clear is that whatever this figure's original name was, he is a figure inspired by Has-Satan from the Hebrew Bible, and even the root of the word mastema is 3 consonants in Hebrew, sin, tet, mem, or STM if you transliterate, whereas Satan is STN, sin, tet, nun. So it's basically a cognate noun of Satan. So the etymological roots of the 2 names are very similar. So it's pretty clear that this figure has been influenced by Has-Satan in the Hebrew Bible and is intended as some kind of extension or development thereof. But there are some ways in which Jubilees develops beyond what we find of Has-Satan in Job or Zechariah. Firstly, he's clearly an individual and not merely a role or an office, because some might argue that in Job and Zechariah, it's not one particular being that we find in both accounts, but it's just an office that might be held by different angelic beings at different times. But in Jubilees, mastema is clearly an individual. Secondly, he does not operate alone, but rules over a contingent of evil spirits. So that's quite a significant development. And thirdly, he's portrayed more negatively than the biblical Has-Satan. For instance, when Abraham passes the Akedah test or the Akedah test with the sacrifice of Isaac, it is said that mastema is shamed. On another occasion, he's temporarily bound to prevent him from accusing Israel. I think that's on the Day of Atonement, if memory serves. And here we see, again, interesting parallels to the New Testament, where the Satan is also said to be bound on several occasions, like in Jesus' parable of the binding of the strong man, and also in Revelation chapter 20, Satan is said to be bound and thrown in the abyss. Mastema also foretells, quote, my punishment, but scholars can't really agree on whether this refers to him as the punisher or the punished. So he's somehow involved in eschatological punishment, but whether he's the one doing the punishing or whether he's one of the ones being punished is not really clear from the text. But again, as in Job and Zechariah, mastema is subordinate to God and has access to the heavenly court. So that's Jubilees, and I think it's quite an important text in terms of the development of this idea. I don't know if you have any questions about Jubilees before we go on to the last Jewish source that I wanted to look at.
No, I mean, this is very fascinating. What's the date of Jubilees? Do you know the
It's
dating?
it's usually dated to mid second century BC,
Okay.
and I think scholars are pretty confident about that.
Hmm. And then,
Somewhere around the 160s before Christ.
and would you say that this text was in circulation, wide circulation, such that it could have influenced, let's say the New Testament church or the new this Jesus and the early Jesus movement and the contemporary Jews?
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
We know, for instance, that many of the texts at Qumran, the Dead
Hmm.
Sea Scrolls, that were written by the Qumran sect, they, I mean, there are fragments of Jubilees that were preserved at Qumran.
Hmm.
There are books like the Damascus document that quote from the Book of Jubilees and were influenced by it, as well as this text called Pseudo Jubilees. So clearly, the Qumran sect, which was destroyed in AD 70 during the Jewish War. So they were, contemporaries of the apostles
Right.
when their movement came to an end. So they were heavily influenced by the Book of Jubilees. So
Mm.
I think we have every reason. And I mean, it wasn't only them, because otherwise, how did the Book of Jubilees survive outside of the Qumran sect?
Hmm.
So I think it's pretty clear that it had an influence on Jewish thought at this time.
It was in the air, if you will.
Yeah.
Mhm. All right, I'm ready to keep going.
Okay. All right. So the last text that I think we have time to discuss is the parables of Enoch. So if you've heard of the Book of Enoch, sometimes referred to as First Enoch, that's a composite work that has about what were originally 5 different texts within it, dating from different times and places. And there's various, redaction and editing that goes on for it to reach its final form. But the Parables of Enoch is a section of that book, chapters 37 to 71 of the Book of Enoch, which originally was a standalone work. And it's now dated by most scholars to the late 1st century BC or early 1st century AD. Now, I would say there's a bit less confidence or certainty about the date of this work than that of Jubilees, but most scholars now do date it to that period. And some scholars have even argued from its geographical and botanical information, the plants that it refers to and so on, that it actually comes from Galilee, which would be quite interesting in light of the origins of the Jesus movement. The parables only survive in Ge'ez. So unlike Jubilees, we don't even have fragments of the work in any other language. And they describe a figure called Azazel, who is kind of like the ultimate evil angel. But he may have been called Asael in the original Hebrew or Aramaic. The reason why I say that is because in other parts of the Book of Enoch, where the Ge'ez text has Azazel, and they have found the fragments of the original Aramaic of those parts of the book in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the name in the original was actually Asael. So it's possible in the parables as well that it was originally Asael. So this book is mainly interested in this figure of Asael or Azazel for his eschatological punishment. So like he's doomed to eschatological punishment. It describes a burning furnace being prepared for the host of Azazel, and for Azazel and all his associates and all his host. And readers familiar with Matthew will immediately recognize the similarity to Matthew 25:41, which refers to eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And elsewhere in Matthew, that eternal fire is actually referred to as a furnace, just the term that Parables of Enoch uses. And this, strikingly as well, both Matthew's and the parables' descriptions of this eschatological punishment take place in the context where a figure called the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory. So that's fairly distinctive language that's used in both the parables of Enoch and Matthew when describing this eschatological scene. The parables of Enoch also refer to a class of heavenly beings called Satans in plural, from whom humans learn violence and who are driven away by the archangel Phanuel. And there's an angel mentioned also in the text named Gadrael, who's probably one of the Satans. And this angel is said not only to have taught humans how to use weapons and do violence, but he's also said to have led Eve astray. And this is probably the only pre-Christian reference to a transcendent being's involvement in the Garden of Eden, in the serpent's deceit of Eve. The parables also have two references to Satan in the singular. We can't be sure whether it's referring to the Satan with a definite article or Satan as a proper name, because the Ge'ez language has no definite article, similar to Latin in that respect. One passage speaks of angels of punishment preparing all the instruments of the Satan, and this seems to mean that Satan is involved in the punishment of the kings of the earth. So he's the punisher, in this case, not the punished. However, another text states that the host of Azazel will be punished for becoming the servants of Satan, or of the Satan. So this seems to identify Azazel or Asael with the Satan. It seems to imply that they are one and the same. So to summarize, in the parables, the Satan seems to be the title or designation of a malevolent angel called Asael, named Asael or Azazel, who leads a host of other angels or Satans. And their functions are to lead humanity astray and to inflict punishment, but they themselves are destined for eschatological punishment. And that's, I think, about the earliest, or one of the earliest texts where that is the case. There are a few texts at Qumran as well from the Dead Sea Scrolls that we don't have time to get into. So that's sort of all the Jewish background that I wanted to mention. However, there's one thing I want to emphasize, that these few texts that I've referred to from the Hebrew Bible and from extra biblical Jewish literature, I don't want to claim that these are representative by any means of the full range of Jewish thought. Far from it, in fact. I mean, you have the works of Josephus, the works of Philo. These are massive, voluminous bodies of literature that make no mention of any such figure as the devil or the Satan. Okay, and many other Jewish texts of the period make no reference to such a figure. So it's certainly not the case that from these few texts that we have discussed, we can extrapolate to a sort of Jewish orthodoxy or sort of an inevitable march toward the devil that we find in the New Testament, as though that was a foregone conclusion that things were going to end up with that idea. It was not like that at all. Even some apocalyptic works of Second Temple Judaism, like 4 Ezra, make no mention of the Satan in any form. And there's even one text from Qumran called 4Q Barki Nafshi. It's a liturgical text, which has a hymn that alludes to Zechariah 3, but appears to replace Has-Satan in this, when the Lord rebukes Has-Satan. Instead, it says the Lord rebukes Yetzer Ra, which is a Jewish term meaning the evil inclination. So it's like something internal that is leading us to sin. So this seems to reflect kind of a demythologizing move on the part of the author of this text, who's taking this external figure of Has-Satan in Zechariah 3 and replacing it with something internal to the human being. So this just illustrates the range of options that were available in the diversity of Second Temple Judaism. Some seem not to have had any interest or maybe even any belief in such a figure as the Satan, and others seem to almost want to get rid of him from the Hebrew Bible or reinterpret him as a non-mythical figure. And yet we have these other texts that certainly move in the mythical direction of developing more attributes and characteristics of this celestial opponent. And so I think the all-important question when we come to the New Testament then is, which sort of Jewish framework or view that existed in the Second Temple period do we see the New Testament kind of picking up and running with?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, which strand of Judaism got picked up on by the apostles and Jesus. I mean, this is why, for example, when people say like the Jewish canon of scripture during the time of Jesus, I'm like, well, which one, right? People seem to just think that, you know, Judaism in the Second Temple period was this monolithic thing. It was all united. You know, everyone agreed on the temple and its validity in Jerusalem. Everybody had the same doctrine, you know, just things like that. And there, you know, there was no need for any institution or hierarchy. And it's like, well, no, like it was very diverse. It was all over the place. And, you know, it's so interesting to see in the New Testament which strand of Judaism ultimately won out in the Christian movement or the Jesus movement. It's so fascinating to study that. But anyway, so I think you're now going to discuss then which strand or which movement won in the New Testament.
Yeah, so I won't probably go into quite as much detail here, but you know, the first thing I want to mention is that when we read about the Satan and the devil in the New Testament, these are not sort of bland, obligatory references to a popular Jewish doctrine. It's not as though the writers felt that this is part of the wider cultural worldview, and therefore we sort of are obliged to mention it here and there, but we're not really interested in it. As I said before, the only reason why Paul is mentioning the Satan in the Corinthian correspondence seems to be that he must have taught the Gentile Corinthians about this concept himself. So if it wasn't important, if it was just sort of part of the background that they could just as easily have done without, then why did he teach it to the Gentile converts, right? Another thing to notice is that in the New Testament, these are actually, as far as I'm concerned, the earliest texts that make the Satan the normative designation for this leading transcendent opponent, because you have it Has-Satan in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. Other than that, okay, arguably in Sirach as well, we didn't discuss that text, but other than that, you know, these texts like Jubilees uses the term mastema, Parables of Enoch, it uses Azazel or Asael. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Qumran literature, Belial is the most common term for the evil one. Melki Ressa comes up in Qumran, which is a Aramaic name meaning the king of wickedness. And then the term the angel of darkness comes up a lot or a few times in the Qumran literature as well. So there's this diversity, even among the Jewish texts that witness to a belief in this leading transcendent opponent. There's a diversity of terminology. And the New Testament kind of comes along and says, no, the normative designations of this figure are Hos Satanas and Hos Diabolos, one basically being a transliteration of the term we find in the Hebrew Bible, and the other being a translation into Greek. Of course, we do, as I say, find other terms, but used for the devil in the New Testament, but they're more like descriptive terms as opposed to other names. So there's like a process of consolidation that we see in the New Testament. They're not just borrowing haphazardly from ideas that were out there, but there's kind of a systematizing and synthesis of the received traditions about Satan into a very particular kind of concept, without denying, you know, that there is diversity within the New Testament in terms of each writer sort of having his own take on how to describe this figure. And I think we can even see this consolidation happening in the famous, what's called the Beelzebul pericope in the Synoptic Gospels, in Mark chapter 3, Matthew 12, and Luke 11, where the scribes or Jesus' opponents basically accuse him of being in league with the ruler of demons, whom they call Beelzebul. And, you know, Jesus goes on to refute their accusations, but in doing so, he refers to the evil figure in question as the Satan. He doesn't accept or adopt the terminology that they used of Beelzebul. So again, there's this emphasis that no, the Satan is the normative designation for the prince of evil.
So just to jump in really quick right there. So when, you know, and then I don't know why this might be my Baptist background. I feel so uncomfortable saying the names of the demons, you know, but with Beelzebub, right? Would you say that was then the name that the Pharisees and the scribes had given to what we call the Satan or Satan today, or is that a totally different thing? Like is he just a separate demon, or what is he? You know?
Um, okay, a couple of things. First of all, it's really difficult
Mm-hmm.
to speak with any degree of certainty about the origin of the name Beelzebul because
Mm-hmm.
it's never found outside the Synoptic Gospels except
Wow.
for
Hmm.
a text called the Testament of Solomon that is like 3 or 4 centuries later.
Hmm.
So there's no Jewish text from this period that actually mentions Beelzebul. Now some scholars argue that the name is derived from Beelzebub which was a god, the god of Ekron in the Old Testament. But I think the more convincing explanation is that it comes from an Aramaic term meaning the master of the house.
Hmm.
But I won't get too far into that. But there's also the question among New Testament scholars of whether the Gospels intend to make this one-to-one identification between Beelzebul and the Satan. And there are different views, and even among the different Gospels, because they word the account slightly differently, some scholars will say, for instance, Mark is definitely making that equation, but Luke seems not to be, or something like that. So there's a range of scholarly opinion. Personally, I'm of the view that all three evangelists seem to make that equation, that when, in effect, when the scribes and Pharisees are talking about this figure called Beelzebul, the prince of demons, Jesus is not denying that there is a prince of demons,
Mm-hmm.
but he is saying, I prefer the term Satan to refer to this figure, in effect.
I see.
So he's
Mm-hmm.
he's not saying, no, you guys are way out of line to even think that there is a prince of demons. The argument boils down not to whether there is supernatural evil, but which side of the supernatural evil is Jesus on. That's basically what the argument is about. Because, Jesus I think in Matthew and Luke even refers to the Pharisees' own disciples performing exorcisms.
Mm.
And then Jesus says, if I am casting out demons by the prince of demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? And then I think one reason coming out of this same passage where we cannot say that this is just sort of bland background that the evangelists, that the writers are not really that interested in. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus kind of stakes his whole mission on his exorcisms, because he says, I think in Matthew he says the Spirit of God, in Luke it's the finger of God, but he says, if I by the finger of God cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you.
Mm-hmm.
So his
Mm-hmm.
whole teaching about the kingdom of God hinges on the fact that he is casting out demons. And he then, in all three of the Synoptic Gospels, he tells this little parable of the binding of the strong man,
Mm-hmm.
where he says, no one can rob a strong man unless they first tie him up. Once they've tied him up, then they can steal his stuff. That's a
Mm-hmm.
paraphrase.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in context, that parable is clearly talking about, Jesus' exorcisms being an assault on the ruler of the demons, the strong man, which is the Satan. So that parable is basically Jesus giving his argument or his interpretation of his exorcism ministry, to say, the kingdom of God is breaking into the world, and I'm binding the Satan, I'm tying him up, I'm sort of immobilizing him and disempowering him through my mission.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well,
So
Thomas, keep
I think
going. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
that's one of the most, I think, important and relevant passages in the Gospels about the devil. And of course, another very well-known one that I can maybe touch on is the temptations or the testing of Jesus in the wilderness, which is a particularly vivid account in that, the devil has a speaking part here. And I think on that note, I can just mention more broadly that in New Testament scholarship, there's various approaches to reading the Gospels and various what we would call types of criticism. You have your historical criticism, you have your source criticism, which is saying, what are the sources that the Gospels use? You have form criticism, which is saying, in what form did these different traditions or stories originate before they got to be in the Gospels? What was their original form? Then you have redaction criticism, which is asking, what was the editorial role that each evangelist had in kind of working with the traditions that he received to convey the theological message that he wanted to get across? But then you also have what's called narrative criticism. Now, narrative criticism basically looks at the Gospels as stories, because they're narratives, right? So, looking at the Gospels in terms of the elements that make up a story, like plot, like character development, like conflict. And from this perspective, it's very clear when you take a narrative critical approach to the Gospels that the devil is one of the characters in the story. Mm-hmm. And he's basically the villain of the story, right? So Satan and demons are not incidental to the narrative. Satan in particular is a significant character. I wouldn't say he's like a star, but he's sort of like a part of the supporting cast in the Gospels. So coming then to the wilderness temptation narrative or testing narrative, some would argue, like Christadelphians, for example, would typically argue that this is a figurative description of an internal struggle. So even though the text appears to describe an encounter between two personal beings, or two individuals, one being Jesus, one being the devil, they would say, no, this is actually the figurative account of Jesus basically struggling in his own mind about his mission, and should he sell out and use his power to turn stones into bread? Should he throw himself off the temple because God will save him? Should he worship the devil and so get the power over all the kingdoms of the world? Now, I think there's a few features of the wilderness temptation narratives in Matthew and Luke, because they're much more detailed than Mark's account, that make this reading of an internal struggle pretty much impossible. One of them is that the account talks about the devil coming, and then at the end of the story, the devil leaves and the angels come to minister to Jesus. I think that's definitely in Matthew. I can't remember if Luke does as well. I don't think so. But the point is, everyone agrees that angels are external personal agents. So it seems to be an inconsistent interpretation to say, okay, the devil comes and goes, but that's just figurative language for an internal struggle. But then angels come, but that's now external. It's an inconsistent reading. Secondly, in both accounts, one of the devil's temptations where he shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, and he then says to him, all these will be yours if you will fall down and worship me. That's how Matthew puts it. And in Luke, he literally says, well, if you worship before me. Now, the language in both cases is explicitly demanding a physical act of worship. So it's not just kind of like mentally serve me or mentally submit to me, but the devil is saying, fall down in Matthew's account, fall on your knees, so to speak, and worship me. And then we have a deal. In Luke, worship before me, which is again, the physical language of in front of me, right? So it implies an interpersonal encounter. There's no two ways about it. You can't fall down and worship a figment of your imagination or an internal voice in your head, so to speak. So I think that already pretty much rules out the idea that this is an internal struggle. Another interesting point to notice is that this account actually draws on a Roman legal principle called traditio longa manu, which basically means something to do with the long hand, handing over with the long hand. Now, this was a a law around the selling of real estate, the selling of land. But the idea is if you sell me some land, there needs to be a point in time where you and I go and see the land together, and we kind of like walk through it, and you show me these are the boundaries of the land. This is what I'm selling you. And only then can the transaction of buying the land sort of become legal. And, you know, some scholars with a legal background who have read this account have said, yeah, that's basically what's happening here. When the devil is showing Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, he's acting like that seller to say, I can close the transaction with you right now. And this can all be yours if you just, you know, meet the price, which is bow down and worship me. So again, once we interpret this and understand this in terms of a transaction, almost like a business transaction that the devil wants to take place here, it becomes pretty far-fetched to say, but this is all happening in Jesus' head. So I think the wilderness temptation narratives for me kind of almost put to rest the idea that that the devil is simply a symbol for human sin, or the urge to sin that might be in human nature. Yeah, I could say more. I could say a word or two about the times when other people, like Peter is called Satan and Judas is called devil in the Gospel of John. I don't know if you want me to say something about that, because sometimes people point to that and say, well, obviously, no, that's not talking about a transcendent being.
Well, yeah. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on Peter and Judas, because the issue of Peter being called Satan, that's one that I've had to encounter before with my kind of work on the papacy. So I want to get to that. And then maybe afterwards we'll summarize just kind of your whole presentation, and then I'll try to maybe ask a few questions that have been kind of burning on my mind. But no, this is Thomas. This is fascinating. You've been blowing my mind left and right. So this has been such a delightful interview. But yes, let's talk about Peter and Judas.
Okay, should I continue?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, in Mark and Matthew, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," after Peter, you know, rebukes Jesus for saying that he's going to die, right? Now, there's another passage in the Gospel of Matthew, I think it's Matthew 10, verse 25, if memory serves, where Jesus makes an interesting remark. He says, if he's talking about his opponents, and he says, if they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more those of his household? So, but then when we go on to Matthew 12, the account of the Beelzebul controversy that we already discussed, the accusation that's being made is not that Jesus is Beelzebul. So they're not literally saying you are Beelzebul, but they're saying that Jesus is in league with, that Jesus gets his power to perform exorcisms from Beelzebul, right? So that already, I think, gives a clue to when Jesus calls Peter Satan, he's not saying Peter literally is the devil, okay? But it's kind of an idiomatic way of saying, as in Matthew 10:25, you are Satan, in the sense that you are being influenced by Satan right now. The words that you're speaking right now, you're saying because Satan has kind of gotten to you. So that's basically my interpretation of that. And I would say something similar of Judas in John chapter 6, verse 70, where Jesus says, "Have not I chosen you 12, and yet one of you is a devil?" There's no definite article. That's the only place in the Gospels or in the New Testament, in fact, where the singular diabolos occurs, I think, and it's not definite. There might be one or two others, maybe in Revelation, but that's not semantically that important, because there's a grammatical rule called Colwell's rule that I won't get into great detail on, but basically it's saying that based on the word order, the word devil here could still be semantically definite, meaning it could still have the same meaning as the devil, even though the word the ha is not actually there in the Greek text. So I think basically, I think the implication of these texts is not that these individuals are the Satan literally, but that they are under the influence of the Satan. And we can see that very clearly later on in John's gospel, because it explicitly says in John 13 that Satan entered into Judas, one of the 12, and then he went on to betray Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of yeah, I mean, so I don't think I disagree with you at all on that interpretation, because I don't think it makes any sense to just say that, like, Peter's literally Satan or Judas is literally Satan, right? In those passages. Probably with Judas though, they're almost like when you say Satan entered Judas, that almost implies a kind of possession, or just maybe he's fallen under the power and influence of the devil, but it's not as if Judas lost his free will. He was still culpable and guilty for what he did. um Now, in terms of Peter, you used Matthew 10:25 as kind of the base for comparison, which is, like, I think valid and makes total sense. When I personally have looked at that passage, I actually go back to the temptation narratives, and the reason why is because in the temptation narratives, and maybe this is more being theologian than it is exegete, right? So I totally accept that. But in those passages, Satan provided a way for Christ to avoid the cross, which is, just, I can give you all the kingdoms of the world. I can make you the prince and the ruler. You just need to bow down and worship me, right? That's the way you avoid the cross. You avoid that cup and it can pass from you. And then when Peter doesn't want Jesus to be crucified, or simply can't accept that, I think in a way, that was maybe a form of temptation, right? Because obviously, when Christ asked for the cup to be passed, or at least the strength to endure what's to come, Peter, it seems to be thinking that there's a way out, right? Just as Satan tried to offer a way out of the cross.
Yeah, I think that's quite a powerful reading. And I would also mention that there's a literary correspondence, at least in Matthew, between those two texts, because
Mm.
What does Jesus say to Peter? He says, I think the Greek word is hupaje, get behind me, Satan.
Mm-hmm.
And he also, in the wilderness, he says to the devil, hupaje, Satan. So
Mm.
get behind me, or get away from me, sort of thing, Satan. I think it's the same Greek word, if
Wow.
memory serves. So there's a
So
correspondence verbally as well.
so you're telling me that it was actually more plausible than I was giving it credit for, my
Yeah.
interpretation.
Ex it's got some exegetical basis as well, yeah.
Let's go. Okay, that's exciting. Okay, then that just might be my official position. But I like 10:25 as well to be included. But anyway, Thomas, so is there anything else you want to add before I just ask you maybe some questions off my hip?
No, I mean, obviously there's, as I said in the beginning, there's about 130 references to the devil in the New Testament. So we could go on for 4 hours talking through every one, but I think we've covered a few of the more detailed texts, I think, and I think they kind of establish a pattern that one can see adhered to throughout the New Testament, with obviously diversity here and there in terms of the role or the terminology that's used.
Mm-hmm. And so, and basically the conclusion of your paper, uh, the one that you sent me, and I wonder if there's like a way that people can access that. Um, but the conclusion of the
Yep,
paper,
there is.
mhm, on your
Even
academia
though
page, or
I think on the academia page, you can access a preprint version.
mhm,
Um, it's not allowed for me to put the official published version for copyright reasons on the academia page, but
right?
I
Mhm,
was allowed to link to it from my personal website. The copyright does allow for that. So
mhm.
if anyone goes to my personal website, www.dianoigo.com, there is a link to the paper there that if you click will actually open the published version of it.
Yeah, and I'll link that in the description. Uh, so Thomas, let me just ask you a few questions here. So one thing that kind of stood out to me in the whole presentation is that, and maybe this is something that just needs to be reaffirmed, because I know I've heard this before, but the idea that Satan, right, is not kind of just running free right now without being under the thumb of God, if you will. In a sense, Satan's on a leash. And I think I wonder if that image is actually there in the book of Revelation, where the devil seems to be on a leash or he's being restrained. Um, but you know, he's very much still under the power of God. It's not like he's, I don't know, obviously we don't want to affirm this, but sometimes we get this image in our heads of like Satan as this equally powerful force, like yin and yang or something like that, or positive and negative, right? But that's not how it is. He's very much subordinate to God. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely right. He's a creature. He's not omnipotent. He has finite power. Um, and also, this tradition that we find in the Jewish literature that we discussed, in which Satan is somehow almost like a divine functionary, like
Mm-hmm.
working for God in a sense. That's not completely abandoned in the New Testament. There's a tension whereby this figure, because we know that God is able to use evil for his own purposes, right?
Mm-hmm.
That goes for human, Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament is an example of a Gentile king that isn't the greatest guy, but God is able to use him for his purposes. And I think we see the same with Satan. And there's actually an article by an evangelical scholar named Sidney Page called Satan, God's Servant. And he
Mm-hmm.
basically makes this argument that much of what Satan does, Satan being evil might view it a different way than God views it, right? Like when Satan tempts somebody, God allows it because testing has a positive connotation. By being tested, our faith can grow. So that's just one example of how Satan might do one thing, but God might be allowing it to happen for a different purpose. And so Satan could sort of inadvertently be serving God, despite actually being a fallen angel who's in fact evil and destined for perdition.
And then throughout the Old Testament, you know, we see the image of, I guess, the Satan or Satan change and transition, right? So, um, you know, for example, with the Old Testament, especially in the book of Genesis, we see the serpent in the garden. And then we learn in the book of Revelation that it's definitely named that that serpent was the devil. And then elsewhere we see the angel of death in the plagues is identified as Satan. I believe you said in Jubilees, if I recall properly. And then as we, yeah, you correct
Well,
me if I'm wrong.
I would add not only in Jubilees, but
Mm,
I argued. So this paper that you referred to is not my only paper on this subject.
I see. Mm-hmm.
There's another paper that I co-authored with Dr. Guy Williams, where in basically there our aim was to identify every reference to the devil in the New Testament. And we argued there that in Hebrews 11, verse 28,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is not widely regarded or recognized as a reference to the devil, but it's a reference to the destroyer of the firstborn. And we make an argument in that paper that Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, actually understands that destroyer of the firstborn from Exodus to be the devil, just
Mm-hmm.
as the book of Jubilees understood that figure to be Mastema.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you find in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 10, that Paul also refers to the Israelites who rebelled in the wilderness being destroyed by the destroyer. And I think one can again make an argument there that the destroyer for Paul is another term for what he elsewhere refers to as the Satan.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 5, Paul is talking about delivering the person who's guilty of incest, deliver him to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that the
Mm-hmm.
spirit may be saved in the day of Christ Jesus. So there's
Mm-hmm.
this destroying function that the Satan has elsewhere in 1 Corinthians. So it would seem to make sense that Paul is understanding this destroying transcendent being from the Old Testament to also be the Satan. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's only Jubilees that makes that move. I think it's actually found in the New Testament itself.
So when we talked about, you know, Satan being like God's executioner, and he gets cast out of heaven. Now, the question is, when does this happen? Would it happen? Would have had happened before creation, or maybe before the Garden of Eden was made, something like that? Did it happen maybe in the middle of the Old Testament? When do you think Satan was thrown out of heaven?
So I think, that's a really difficult one to answer from the Bible, because the Bible doesn't narrate the devil's fall as a sort of historical or prehistorical event.
Mm.
There are references to it. For example, in Luke 10:18, Jesus says, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven." And then we also have in Revelation 12 this account of, a war in heaven between Michael and his angels on the one hand, and the dragon and his angels on the other, which the dragon being identified as the devil and Satan. But again, this is, Revelation is a highly symbolic book, and it's a vision. So there's sort of no telling, if this is describing something that literally happened in heaven, when did it happen?
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say the Bible doesn't really answer the question. That would be my take, exegetically speaking.
Mm.
Theologically speaking, I think the tradition of the church identifies this as having happened primordially. So,
See.
before Adam and Eve fell, the serpent is already being influenced by a fallen angel. However, what might perhaps be investigated or considered is that, a bit like the line that I mentioned from St. Justin Martyr that I referred to earlier, that there's sort of a period in which the devil's fall is sort of veiled even to him.
Hmm.
So he's maybe, I'm speculating a bit here, but he's sort of rebelled, but hasn't really lost his official standing in the heavenly court yet.
I see.
And I think there's also an argument to be made that the death of Christ is quite a definitive event in the history of the devil, because we have, for example, in Hebrews, that the devil was destroyed by the death of Christ. Now that word destroy doesn't necessarily mean like annihilate, but it can mean to render powerless or to render impotent. So, but also in Revelation 12, it's clear from the hymn that's being sung there that by his blood, Jesus has defeated the devil definitively. So I think there's maybe a sense in which, and I think you can find this in the church fathers like St. Justin, that Satan may have fallen in the beginning, sort of way back, but that sort of becomes definitively known both to him and to everybody else sort of after the cross.
Yeah. So, there's just so many interesting things, questions that I could ask. I'm trying to be conscious of time though, because I think we've almost gone 2 hours. So, yeah. So I'm trying to remember now the trajectory of my question. So, yeah, I was talking about when exactly did the fall happen. Tradition holds that it happened in a primordial time, and then it's interesting. Then, so the devil still kept his official position, and he thought he was still, fine to operate, right? But eventually, it's made definitively known with the death of Christ that he has no place in heaven. He has no place with God. So yeah, then that would mean he was on a leash for a while as like this angel or functionary. Okay, I'm just trying to like process and put all this together. This is really interesting. So Thomas, here's another question that someone might have. Based on the biblical text, we said that Satan is God's executioner, but doesn't wasn't Satan supposed to be a musician, right? Isn't this what we get from, I think, Ezekiel? Some people will mention that. Is there any basis for thinking that he was once responsible for the music in heaven?
It's a fairly indirect basis. There's these two texts in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. One is basically about the king of Babylon. The other one is the king of Tyre. But there's a long tradition going back, I think, to the early church, of reading these texts as having another layer of meaning. So the literal meaning may be about this human king, but it's kind of indirectly or at a higher level pitch, it's kind of speaking about the devil as well. And I think some have argued even that when Jesus says, I saw Satan like lightning fall from heaven, that this is actually an allusion to Isaiah 14. So in which case that idea, that reading of the text could go back to the New Testament itself. But yeah, it's again, it comes back, I guess, to that distinction we made earlier in reading the Old Testament between the historical critical meaning of the text and kind of the theologically informed reading of the text through the lens of, the Christ event. And I think there are passages like, even the serpent in the Garden of Eden, from a historical critical point of view, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is just a serpent. But already in the New Testament, as you mentioned in Revelation, that's being interpreted as, no, that's the devil and Satan are somehow the serpent or involved with the serpent. So, and as I mentioned before, that's found before the New Testament in the parables of Enoch as well, although it's an angel named Gadriel who's responsible for enticing Eve there. So yeah, I guess it comes down to what one is willing to do or prepared to do in terms of theological interpretation of the New Testament. So if we do allow that reading of Ezekiel 28, then you can arrive perhaps at the conclusion that Satan may have originally had some of these functions. So I guess it's a little bit speculative, but I'm not saying it's an invalid approach or that it shouldn't be investigated.
Sure. And one last thing, and then I want to get your last thoughts too. But I remember learning about, as a Thomist, so kind of going even further away from the original biblical context, although not really, because I think Thomas was right with the metaphysics and everything. That I think Thomas talked about how the angelic intellect, it can't like look at the world and get information from the world. All the information that an angel gets is from above, from God, if you will. So it's not like, I look at this object and I extract information from it. Whereas with the angelic intellect, it's God bringing down information to the angel, and it's through that information, through that light of God, that it sees things. And so it's interesting that, Satan is still an angel. He's just a fallen angel. He's the angel of death. He's the angel of destruction. He's the evil spirit, whatever you want to call it, or him. But he's still under the power and dominion of God. I don't know why that's still blowing my mind, but I mean, because I know this, right? I mean, I know this stuff, but it's just it's I think seeing that connection between what Aquinas was saying and what the Old Testament seems to portray about the devil, that he's still being used by God. When even though he's cast out of heaven, that doesn't mean that God's like, okay, I wash my hands of him, don't have to do anything with him anymore. It's like, even though he's cast out, he's still on the leash, though. I mean, that I don't know why that's blowing my mind, but that is.
Yeah, it's sort of paradoxical, right?
Yeah.
Because you would expect it to sort of be strictly one or the other, but I think that gets back to the mystery of evil and the power of God, that he can use evil for a greater good, even when we don't necessarily see or understand what that is.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, let me let you have the last word. Summarize your case, some of the things we talked about, and for anybody who is interested in your work, I'll try to link your website in the description. But if there's anything else you want to share, please do.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the case, the evidence speaks for itself in terms of when you read the New Testament carefully and in light of its Jewish background and the Hebrew Bible and the Septuagint. I don't really see how one can come away thinking that this is either a non-mythical idea or a faded mythological conception that the writers are just not interested in. The question then of between the first and the second views that we referred to, can we believe in the New Testament world of miracles and Satan and demons, I think there it's not just a question about Satan and demons anymore. It's a question about, can you believe in miracles? Can you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Can you believe in all of the supernatural things that we find in the New Testament? And if you can believe in all those other supernatural things, then I don't think it's a big step to also accept the biblical teaching concerning Satan and demons. Maybe the last thing I can say is just specifically about Catholicism and how it handles the subject of transcendent evil. Because, in our last conversation, we spoke about my faith journey towards the Catholic Church, and I obviously was very interested as I was encountering Catholicism and what it had to say about this. And one of the things that I really respected and liked about the Catholic Church is when I came to understand how it views not only Satan, but also exorcisms, because the New Testament says Jesus not only performed exorcisms, but he told the disciples to go and perform exorcisms, and they did. And we find exorcisms happening in the book of Acts and so on. And, a lot of churches and denominations today are either kind of scared of the whole idea and therefore won't even, you'll be looked at like you're crazy if you talk about an exorcism, like, no, we don't do that. Or on the other hand, you have certain movements that are over the top in terms of, every little problem that comes along, no, that requires an exorcism, you're demon possessed. So there's these two extremes, and I think the Catholic Church has a ministry of exorcism, a rite of exorcism, but it's used very with a lot of care and discretion. It's used as a last resort, and only by specially trained priests. So it's not like a willy-nilly anything goes approach to exorcism, but it's also not like just a denial that we see in some other Christian traditions where they almost would be embarrassed to admit that Jesus and the apostles were exorcists. I don't think we should be embarrassed by it. And I think when you see that the apostles performed exorcisms, the Catholic Church performs exorcisms, there's something in support of the Catholic Church's claims to be the church that was founded by Jesus on the apostles. So I think at the end of the day, I would say the words of C.S. Lewis ring true when he talks about the two equal and opposite errors that one can fall into on this subject of the devil or demons. Either you can not believe in them, or you can be too much interested in them and sort of get interested in the occult and things like that. So I think, we shouldn't make the devil into a huge topic as though it's right up there with the Trinity in terms of importance in Christian doctrine or something like that. Not at all. But at the same time, I mean, truth is important. So if God has revealed that there is this powerful creature called the devil, then we should know about it, and we should beware, I suppose.
I should add though that there are Protestants who are exorcists. I think even the Baptist tradition there are some. But in terms of, I think to kind of maybe add my thoughts to your point there, like the Catholic Church has been around for so many, hundreds and 2,000 years, and it has never changed. Like, it's always acknowledged the reality of the devil and evil spirits and, the demons. And when you think about, like, if you need an exorcist, right, the number one thing that pops up in your head first is a Catholic priest. Like, I'm just going to say it out like that. Like today, when you think about what is the image of an exorcist, it's a Catholic priest. Now you might say, oh, that's because of social media. That's because of popular culture. Sure. But even then, there's a reason why it's even there in popular culture, because the church never gave up that ministry, and it is very aware of the reality of the devil and his angels. And so yeah, I mean, that's maybe something I would add to your point there, Thomas. But I know for Protestants who might be watching, they might say, hey, we have exorcists too. And it's like, yeah, you do. So just to be fair. Well,
Yeah,
Thomas, that's
maybe
all I
just
have for you.
one
Sure.
last very, very quick point.
Yeah.
I just want to mention one other objection to the devil's existence that's often made is this idea of the devil made me do it. In other words, if the
Mm.
devil exists, then our moral culpability for sin somehow falls away. And I just want to very quickly say that's not the case, because Christian doctrine does not teach that the devil can force us to do anything against our will.
Mm.
So just like there can be other sources, external sources of testing and temptation that may come into our lives, but that doesn't mean that we are innocent when we sin. It's the same with the devil. It's just sort of a different kind or order of temptation and testing. So the idea, if somebody says the devil made me do it, they're not reflecting true Catholic teaching or Christian doctrine about this subject.
Right. Well, thank you, Thomas, for this wonderful interview and presentation. I mean, I'm still blown away. I'm probably going to be watching this multiple times. This is just so fascinating, so fascinating. But thank you so much for your time. It's good to talk to you again.
Thanks. All right. Take care.